The Five Nights at Freddy's franchise now has a total of 11 different games that create a deep and complex story, and within that story there are many mysteries that remain unsolved to this day. The franchise is known for having iconic mysteries that have remained unsolved for almost 10 years, and many of those mysteries come from Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach and Ruin. These two Fnaf projects are regarded as some of the most popular and complex games in the franchise, as there's a lot of old content in these games that relates to past Fnaf games, and there's a lot of new content that sets up future Fnaf projects. And throughout this channel I've made many videos on different ideas, characters, and even endings on both of these projects. And in my last video, I've combined different theories together to make one single video, so in this video, I'm going to do exactly that as well. In this video, I'm going to combine every single one of my theories from FNAF Security Breach and from the Ruin DLC into one long video, so enjoy this single video covering two of FNAF's most complicated projects. Starting with one of the most important characters that might appear in future FNAF projects, let's answer who the Blob is and what its purpose is. First, let's go over what the Blob is. In FNAF Security Breach, Gregory goes to the lowest point in the pizzeria, which was revealed to be the location from FNAF 6, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place. There, he finds a sinkhole that goes to an even lower level where he finds Burntrap, who gets released from his charging station and takes over control of Freddy. Then the Blob tries to stop Gregory, but then Gregory is able to burn Burntrap alongside the Blob, and this is known as the Burntrap ending. But what is this amalgamation of different animatronics? Well, it includes the FNAF 1 versions of Chica and Bonnie, it includes the Puppet, Circus Baby, parts of Mangle, and at the head of it all is Funtime Freddy. Now, by no means are these the original animatronics from the past restaurants, especially since animatronics like the Puppet were burned down in the FNAF 6 ending. So what is the Blob and why is it alive when all these souls from the animatronics have been put to rest? Well, using evidence from the first Tales from the Pizzaplex novel, we learned that when workers were cleaning out the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location from FNAF 6 for the construction of the Pizzaplex, one of the workers programmed an endoskeleton to tear apart any animatronics left in the location. It would then throw all parts in a single pile until the endoskeleton started tearing apart the human workers. It then throws the humans into the pile of animatronic parts before one of the workers is able to escape and tells the other construction workers to seal off the location. And in Security Breach, this is exactly what we see, a mesh of animatronic parts all sealed off in a location. Now, many theories about the Blob, and even in MatPat's theory, it's believed that agony is what fuels the Blob. Agony is a substance that is fueled purely by hatred, sadness, anger, and the bad memories infused with one's soul. So the agony of all the construction workers meshed with the robotic parts of the animatronics created the Blob. There's actually more examples of employees' bodies missing, like when multiple employees were murdered during a mandatory staff meeting, and we even see this site in Security Breach. It's believed that they were murdered by endoskeletons and that their bodies went missing, but what if their bodies were thrown into the already growing pile? There was also another incident where an excavation team found the abandoned FNAF 6 pizzeria, but they never made it out. Again, it's most likely that the bodies are now inside of the Blob as it gains more agony. This could also be why Glamrock Freddy says this when he first finds the Blob.
My friends are here. They're so angry, confused, but I can protect you.
His friends could be referring to the employees of the pizzeria, and it makes a lot of sense. The Blob alone solves many mysteries from FNAF Security Breach, and his character is much more important than just solving mysteries. So now that we know the Blob is just an amalgamation of construction workers' bodies and animatronic parts being fueled by agony, why is the Blob still important? Well, like I mentioned before, unlike Burntrap, the Blob has continued to show up in the FNAF franchise even though his character was made out to be not canon. Throughout FNAF Ruin, comic book style drawings can be found of each of Security Breach's endings, and this is the franchise's way of saying they're not canon anymore. This included the Burntrap ending, so again the game was hinting that neither Burntrap or the Blob were canon and that they never even existed. But in Ruin, we actually see the Blob for a split second. When walking down to the abandoned pizzeria, the Blob can be seen through the hole of a wall before retracting itself, meaning that it was actually canon. Although this is the only time the Blob is seen in the entire DLC, but there still has to be meaning to his character if Studio Studios went out of their way to include it for a split second. And with the recent release of the newest FNAF project being Help Wanted 2, the Blob was actually supposed to make an appearance before it was ultimately cut from the game. In the game files, it was found that the Blob, or also known as Tangled in the files, was supposed to make an appearance in the Fizzy Fizz Night minigame. It could have been that you needed to avoid his tentacles, or that it would have replaced Chica in the garbage area. But either way, the Blob was supposed to be in this game, and it's obvious that Studio Studios are pointing points to this character. And the reason why I think the Blob still matters in the FNAF franchise is because I think we'll see more of this character in future FNAF projects. The Mimic from FNAF Ruin and the Blob are the only two characters with unfinished stories, so it only makes sense that both of them will appear in future FNAF games. In one of my previous videos, I went over how we might get a FNAF Zero project that would act as an origin game that takes place in Fredbear's family diner. Here we might be able to learn more about the Mimic and its backstory since we know it predates a lot of the pizzerias. It could then set up the Mimic as the main villain for the next game, where we might even see the Blob. And what I think is even more likely is that the Mimic and the Blob will combine into one animatronic and will be known as Tangled. Now I know that may seem far-stretched, but think about it. This was essentially already a theory when Security Breach was first released. Many believed that it was possible that the Blob and Burn Trap combined into one animatronic when the pizzeria was burned down. But with this theory, I think it makes even more sense since we know the Blob is fueled by agony, and what better way to get more agony than from the Mimic? We know that the Mimic was built on agony when his creator relentlessly destroyed him, transferring all of his rage and sadness onto the animatronic. So now that the Mimic is freed from the end of ruin, and now that we know that the Blob also roams free in the abandoned pizzeria, why wouldn't they encounter each other and why wouldn't they become one? Thus becoming a new villain in a new FNAF game. But even if none of this happens, what I can say for certain is that the Blob is still a very important animatronic in the FNAF franchise, and it's inevitable that we'll see it again in a future project. Moving on to a character that has little to no information about, let's attempt to answer who one of the most mysterious characters is from the Afton family, Miss Afton. Starting with the most popular theory, and the one that is essentially regarded as canon or confirmed by the community, which is that Miss Afton is actually Ballora from FNAF's sister location. The reason fans started believing in this theory is because of Ballora's very human characteristics and because of certain voice lines in sister location. It's believed that William Afton murdered his wife and stuffed her body inside the Ballora animatronic, which gave her life. But most of the assumption for this theory comes from sister location, as many fans make the argument that Ballora seems like some sort of mother figure throughout the game. Some fans even go as far as saying that Ballora even talks like a mother, which would make sense if it is actually Miss Afton, as she would be talking to her own son Michael. But in Security Breach, there was actually a piece of evidence that could be supporting this idea. More specifically, it was an Easter egg. This Easter egg of 5 staff bots representing the members of the Afton family, with this one representing Miss Afton. Some people were quick to point out that the staff bot looks a lot like Ballora with their similar colors, which would essentially confirm they are the same character. So at the surface, this theory would be true, and it makes sense why this theory has been so widely believed for years now in this community. But besides this piece of evidence from Security Breach that really can be interpreted in any way, there just isn't any concrete evidence supporting this theory. There would also be no reason for William Afton to murder his wife, so unfortunately it isn't confirmed like many people assume. But moving on to the next theory, which is actually fairly new, and it's MatPat's theory, where Miss Afton takes over Fazbear's Entertainment after the FNAF 6 ending and had a goal in rebuilding her family. Now this theory does a great job in not only answering who Miss Afton is and what her role was in the franchise, but it also answers one of the biggest questions from Security Breach, which is who takes over the business after FNAF 6. This is something the franchise has continuously been pointing at, and it being Miss Afton does actually make a lot of sense considering what we know about repeating themes and characters in the series. In this theory, she tries to bring back her husband William Afton in the form of Glitch Trap and Burn Trap. We know she's successful, as in one of the endings of Security Breach we do see Burn Trap come to life. I also think that this theory is the most logical answer to who Miss Afton is, and narratively it also makes the most sense. But unfortunately, the FNAF Ruin DLC disproves this theory. In Ruin, we learn that the Burn Trap ending isn't even canon, as it reveals the Princess Quest ending is instead canon, meaning that Burn Trap never even existed. And with MatPat's theory, this was one of the main points. Without Burn Trap proving that Miss Afton was bringing back her family, this theory just doesn't make as much sense. Sure, Miss Afton could still be in control of Fazbear's Entertainment and is trying to bring back her family in another way, but with Rune's inclusion of new characters like the Mimic and Cassie, it's obvious that the franchise is moving away from old stories and characters like the Afton family, which leads me to believe that Miss Afton isn't in control, and instead it's possible that it's a whole new character. But moving on to the last theory, which I think is the least likely, is that Miss Afton does not exist in the franchise at all. Now what fans mean with this is that obviously Miss Afton was alive at some point, but she just doesn't make an appearance in any game, minigame, or even as an Easter egg. Before the release of FNAF Security Breach, this was actually somewhat true. Miss Afton was nowhere to be found, and even in this poster from FNAF 6 that depicts the Afton family, again Miss Afton is nowhere. There's this bear who is supposed to represent Fredbear, who we know is the crying child. There's the clown who is supposed to be Circus Baby, who we also know is Elizabeth Afton, and of course there's William Afton with his puppet Michael Afton. If Miss Afton had played some role in the franchise, Scott Cawthon could have easily included her in this poster or anywhere else in this series, but he actually does, and this is why I think this theory is wrong. In FNAF's sister location, it's believed that we do see Miss Afton through the TV series that Michael watches on his TV. In the show, we see two characters arguing, with one being a man wearing a purple suit and the other being a woman with blonde hair and a green shirt. Now it's believed that this is William Afton and Miss Afton arguing, which would make sense considering what we know about the Afton family. So it's possible that this TV show was giving us a small look into what the relationship looked like. So we do actually get hints to her character, and like I previously mentioned, we do see Miss Afton in the Security Breach Easter egg, so we know her character existed and had some impact on the story, but the question is to what extent? Well, my thoughts on this are just like many theories in the sense that it's all just assumption. And besides some subtle nods to this character, and besides just one direct confirmation of this character even existing, nothing is known about Miss Afton. It could easily be that she is Ballora or that she's in charge of the business post FNAF 6, but here are my thoughts. Well, I don't think she's Ballora since I don't see any motive for William Afton to murder her and stuff her body in this animatronic. And why would he even make an animatronic that looks like a human if he was going to stuff a body inside of it anyways? Instead, I think that Ballora is just inspired by Miss Afton, and besides that, they have no real correlation. So do I think she took charge of the business in Security Breach and in Ruin? Well, I don't believe in this either, considering that Burn Trap isn't canon anymore, and although it makes sense narratively, I don't find a reason for her to take control of the business. We know that she had almost no impact on the overall franchise, so why would she randomly step back into the business when she already lost so much from it? It's even more random that she would appear again after all those years being away from it, which leads me into what I think. I think that Miss Afton did play a smart part in the franchise until she left William Afton after the death of Elizabeth Afton and stepped away from the business forever. Now I know that this isn't as fulfilling as many other theories, but to me it just makes the most sense considering the little evidence we have. To me it makes sense that she would leave after losing her second child and after losing William Afton to his work, and like I previously mentioned, her taking control of the business wouldn't make that much sense since there isn't a clear motive. But again, this is all just assumption. Moving on to who is arguably the most influential and compelling character from the franchise, let's not only answer if Michael Afton is still alive, but let's also answer what his role is in Security Breach and in Ruin. First, let's go over Michael Afton's appearances throughout the franchise. Following the timeline that's most believed in by the fandom, we first see Michael in FNAF 4 as the main character who is facing hallucinations of the nightmare animatronics. I know it's been believed that the crying child is actually the main character, but there's plenty of evidence supporting it's instead Michael. But moving on, we then see him in FNAF 2 as the security guard on Night 7. Sometime later, we see him again as the main security guard in the first FNAF game. Then we see him in the underground bunker in FNAF's sister location where he is searching for his sister, Elizabeth Afton. But at the end of that game, we see Michael be scooped by this machine, which results in Ennard using his body and controlling him, until Michael Afton throws Ennard up. But instead of this killing him, he actually survives and becomes immortal, as we learn from his monologue.
But something is wrong with me. I should be dead, but I'm not. I've been living in shadows.
We then see him in FNAF 3 once more as a security guard as he looks for his father, and at the end of that game he burns down the pizzeria but manages to escape. We finally see him one last time in FNAF 6, but this time as the manager of the pizzeria who's in charge of the way everything works. He lures the final 4 possessed animatronics left and burns down the pizzeria one last time, but this time he burns with it, and with this Michael Afton's story ended. But what if it didn't? What if Michael Afton is still alive? What if he actually lives in the Pizzaplex? And what if he's actually in control of the Pizzaplex as a co-CEO? Now I know that may seem far-stretched, but I think this can be assumed using plenty of evidence. For starters, this room is found within the Pizzaplex, and it's a one-for-one replica of Michael's room from FNAF's sister location. Many fans have theorized that this is actually the exact same room, meaning that the Pizzaplex was built over the Afton family's house from FNAF 4. But I don't think this is the case, as that would mean the FNAF 4 house was built over the FNAF 6 pizzeria, which wouldn't make sense timeline wise, and there are no other items or things from this house. But why would the Pizzaplex make a room from the Afton family's house if no one would ever see it or know about it? Well, the consensus is that it was for Michael. The TV even works, and there's real popcorn, which to me would imply he's been there frequently or that he even lives there. In this room, there's also this cryptic message. When decoded, it reads a long message, but I want to focus on only the beginning. It reads, "Break and mend, I built the breath." Mend is defined as rebuilding and to restore. Building the breath is referring to giving something life. So to me, this is Michael telling us that he created the Pizzaplex as a whole, and more specifically created the animatronics. He gave them life. And there's more to this message that I'll get back to later in this video, but it's obvious that this room belongs to Michael. And moving on, let's look into 2 more pieces of evidence, starting with Rockstar Row from Security Breach. Now this is a small museum with different artifacts from the past FNAF games or pizzerias. We see things like animatronic parts, posters, drawings, and cardboard cutouts of different characters. These are supposed to be fun and nostalgic displays, but 2 displays specifically are very interesting. This display has 2 artifacts from FNAF 4. These are 2 toys from the Crying Child's room, except that this room isn't the Crying Child's, it's actually Michael's. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, we play as Michael in FNAF 4, meaning these toys are his. Who else in the entire franchise would want to display something from the Afton family house if the artifacts don't directly belong to them? I think this is Michael Afton displaying these his toys as a form of nostalgia for him and as something to remember. But this next display are cardboard cutouts of Ennard, Shadow Bonnie, and Nightmare Balloon Boy. Now all three of these characters have only been seen by Michael. Ennard was inside of his body at one point, Shadow Bonnie was an illusion in the Fnaf 2 pizzeria, and Nightmare Balloon Boy was a hallucination in Fnaf 4. Again, Michael was the only one who knew about these animatronics, so how could they display them without his help? Now why he decided to display animatronics that haunted him and tortured him is a question that I can't really answer, but what I know for certain is that it would have been impossible without Michael. But looking at the last piece of evidence, it comes from Fnaf AR and it's from a scrapped email. Now it can be debated if cut content is canon or not, but for the sake of the video, I'm going with it is canon as it's an important piece of evidence. In this cut content, we actually see an email going to the email address of M. Afton, which I think we can all agree is Michael Afton, meaning he had involvement with either the shipping company or someone else that worked at the pizzeria at one point. This also confirms that he's not only alive, but the fact that he was also involved with the creation of the Pizzaplex. But now that I've gone over the most compelling evidence in support that he's alive, I'm now going to go over how this would all make sense narratively. Michael's entire journey throughout the franchise was bringing down Fazbear's Entertainment and his father, Springtrap. He's successful as he burns down most new locations and burns down all remaining possessed animatronics, so why would he agree to open a new location that is much larger? While using parts of MatPat's theory, I think that Michael and his mother reunited after the Fnaf 6 fire and agreed to open a new location the right way, a way where no one would be hurt and the pizzeria would genuinely be a place where kids could have fun. That's why Michael has his own room, decorated parts of the pizzeria, and why he was in contact with other employees. He's the co-CEO of this new Fazbear's Entertainment, and things were going perfectly until William Afton appears again in the form of Glitchtrap. We know he takes the mind of Vanessa and starts trying to come back into the real world. This whole incident was brought to the attention of the higher-ups, but it was shut down and they even continued to use this virus. So what if this was Miss Afton shutting it down as she knew it was her husband trying to come back and she encouraged the idea? We know the CEO, or Miss Afton, made Vanessa head of security breach even when being informed she was never qualified enough. And like MatPat's theory, her main goal was to bring back her family, and a way she did that was by making Burntrap. But obviously Michael would never be okay with this, so Miss Afton hid everything from him. But eventually when he found out, he would try to stop his father once more and bring down Fazbear's Entertainment once more. Remember that message I talked about earlier in the video? Well, the rest of the message are actually instructions on how to escape and defeat the animatronics. It reads dodge, duck, flash, shoot, crawl, run, crush the vile band. These are all things we see Gregory do throughout Security Breach, and Michael helps us a lot more in the background. Many people assume that Glamrock Freddy wasn't affected by the virus as he booted into safe mode before it happened, and that the reason he booted into safe mode was because he saw Gregory. But what if it was Michael who booted him into safe mode as he knew the virus wouldn't be able to affect him, and as a result, Glamrock Freddy helps Gregory throughout the entire game. Also, in the final boss fight where you defeat Burntrap, these buttons are conveniently there that allow you to burn down the pizzeria. But what if it was Michael who made these buttons in an attempt to stop his father, which again helped Gregory in defeating him? Michael helping Gregory defeat William Afton works for his character and makes sense narratively. So with that said, Michael Afton is still alive in Security Breach and co-founded the new Fazbear's Entertainment with his mother, Miss Afton. Things go well until Miss Afton attempts to bring back William Afton through the form of Burntrap. Michael doesn't agree with her or her action and attempts to stop them in the background of Security Breach's gameplay. And with the help of Gregory, they burn down the pizzeria and Burntrap once more, stopping Miss Afton. But this is just a theory. Now let's look at his role in Ruin. Now Ruin doesn't have as much straightforward evidence as Security Breach does. We actually can't find his room anymore because of the damage done to the Pizzaplex, so the evidence is a lot more subtle. Right before the Mimic is released, Cassie disables the Mex's security system, and later on she finds out that it was the only thing keeping the Mimic trapped. And for the most part, the consensus among the community was that the security system was created by Gregory and Vanessa to contain the Mimic, but recently we learned that this isn't actually the case. In an interview with Fnaf in the Creative Studios, we learned that this machine was designed to look old, hinting that the machine itself is also old. Now, who created the machine can be a video on its own, but I want to focus on who is the one maintaining that machine. Someone had to set up the security nodes that powered Mexis, and someone also had to have taken Gregory down to the abandoned pizzeria, as in the same room where we find the Mexis system, we also find Gregory's backpack. And right after the Mimic is released, Gregory also mentions how his friend has access to the building maps. He also tells Cassie to follow someone's instructions, but the name is cut out by static.
My friend has access to the building maps. Just follow the instructions.
Many fans, including myself, first thought that this person was Vanessa, as that's who we saw Gregory escape with in the canon ending in Security Breach. But what if this wasn't Vanessa? What if it was actually Michael Afton, who appears once more in the franchise in Ruin? Although I don't believe Michael was the one who created Mexis, I still think he was in control of setting up the security nodes and maintaining the machine, as he must have been alive when it was created. Vanessa might know about the machine, but I don't think she would know how it worked or even how to operate it, as she wasn't alive when it was created. And I think the same thing could be said about Gregory's mysterious friend. Sure, Vanessa would know about the layout of the abandoned pizzeria and its surrounding caves, as she brought Freddy down there to clear the path. But I think it would make even more sense that Michael had the layout to the pizzeria, as that's where he supposedly died, and if he really did create the pizzaplex, then he would know all about the caves and the way it works. If Vanessa really was the friend Gregory was talking about, then why cut off her name as if it were some sort of secret? We've known of Annie's and Vanessa's existence ever since Fnaf Help Wanted, so it would almost feel random to try and hide her name. But Michael has never been confirmed to be alive, so if they were trying to hide a name, it makes a lot more sense if they were trying to hide Michael. And lastly, in the secret ending, we saw the Mimic be scooped just like we saw Michael be scooped in FNAF's Central Location. This is a direct parallel that feels intentional. If Michael and Central Location were so heavily influenced into the Pizzaplex, it makes sense to have him included in the DLC in some way, even if he had a very minor role. Now looking at one of my favorite characters from the franchise and a villain that might have a crucial role in the future of the franchise, let's look at 3 different possibilities explaining Burntrap's role in Security Breach and Ruin, starting with a simple answer. First, let's go over what we saw in the Burntrap ending of Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. At the end of the game, Glamrock Freddy and Gregory venture down to the abandoned pizzeria from the end of Five Nights at Freddy 6. There we see the Blob and Burntrap, who is kept alive using a charging station. Burntrap takes control of Freddy using these monitors before Gregory burns down him and the pizzeria. Then in the ending, we see Burntrap try and escape before the Blob grabs him, and it's assumed they both burned in that fire. We then see Gregory and Freddy escape successfully, and in the final moment we see them on top of a hillside. Now up until Ruin's release, this was considered as the canon ending, as it's one of the only endings we got a cinematic scene for, and it made the most sense timeline wise. But then Ruin was released, and with this DLC we learned that the Princess Quest ending was actually canon and not the Burntrap ending. We know this because of various things, like the fact that Cassie is using the same Vanny mask Vanessa leaves behind, Freddy is missing his head and has a hole in his chest like we saw in the ending, and one of the arcade machines has a golden sword through it, meaning the virus was defeated like we saw in the Princess Quest minigames. But what does this mean for the Burntrap ending? Well, what the majority of the fanbase have agreed on, and what I personally believed in, as I even mentioned this in multiple videos now, was that the Burntrap ending was no longer canon like we believed in, which meant Burntrap and the Blob never even existed. Throughout Ruin, comic book style drawings can be found of each of Security Breach's endings, and to me, this was the franchise's way of saying they're not canon to the timeline anymore. This included the Burntrap ending, which was more confirmation that this ending wasn't canon. But when walking down to the abandoned pizzeria, the Blob can be seen through the whole rear wall before retracting itself, meaning that not only does this character exist after all, but Burntrap must also exist, since it wouldn't make sense for one to exist without the other. But how can this be possible if we know for a fact that the ending isn't canon? Well, the most popular theory that I actually have to disagree with is that the Princess Quest ending and the Burntrap ending are both canon, and here's why. Never in the FNAF franchise has more than one ending been canon. Ever since FNAF 3, when more than one ending was even available, only one has been canon that the timeline has followed. For example, it wouldn't make sense for the good and bad ending from FNAF 3 to be canon, as they would be contradicting themselves, and I think this applies to all games with more than one ending. But either way, let's look at some evidence in favor of this ending, with the first simply being that the reason the Pizzaplex is destroyed and withered is because of the fire, which would make sense. And right before the Mimic is revealed, we see Gregory's backpack, meaning he's been down there before when he defeated Burntrap. Now again, all of this would make sense, but there's more evidence disproving this ending ever happened, starting with the simple fact none of these endings would be possible if one of them already happened. If the Princess Quest ending took place first, then there's no way they could have gone down to the FNAF 6 pizzeria, since Freddy loses his body and then we see him leave with Vanessa. If the Burntrap ending took place first, then they wouldn't have been able to go back up to the Pizzaplex, since it was made very clear that the elevator would only work for one trip. And by that time, the pizzeria has already begun to collapse, so I find it hard to believe that they would be able to go all the way back up and stop Vanny. Again, no matter what order these endings would take place, it just wouldn't be possible. Some other small details I wanted to mention are in FNAF Ruin, the FNAF 6 pizzeria doesn't look to have been affected by a fire, especially in the room Burntrap was in. It looks completely fine, and again, it has no effects of a fire. And finally, the only time we see Glamrock Freddy is in Phaser Blast, which is where we last saw him in the Princess Quest ending. But now that I think it's pretty clear the Princess Quest ending is canon, the Burntrap ending isn't, and that Burntrap still exists as a character, the question still stands hands, where is he in ruin? Well, the answer is pretty simple and not that complicated like other theories suggest, like the one that believes Burntrap is now part of the Blob. Although that would be really interesting, when we do see the Blob again, there's really nothing that leads me to believe that Burntrap is now a part of it. We don't see any of his animatronic parts, and the Blob's eyes aren't even glowing purple and aren't even glowing at all. There's also another theory that believes Burntrap is now the Mimic, but this wouldn't make sense either, as when comparing their designs they are drastically different with almost no similarities. It's also hard to believe that Burntrap, who had flesh and different animatronic parts on him, would turn into the Mimic. But with all of that said, I think that Burntrap is simply still inside of his charging station in ruin. Now I know that isn't as fulfilling as other theories, but the evidence is right there. During the Burntrap boss fight in Security Breach, there's a way where you could enter the room where the charging station was, and there you could see that the door was slightly open. But in ruin, when going to that exact same room, the charging station's door is now closed shut. The reason we don't see Burntrap in ruin is because he was never even released from his charging station. Think about it, the only reason Burntrap was even freed was because Glamrock Freddy fell into the pizzeria. Now how exactly this triggered the charging station isn't that clear, but we can assume he was freed to take control of Freddy. So in ruin, when Freddy was never down there, the charging station door never opened and he was never freed. But like I mentioned earlier in the video, we actually see Gregory's backpack in the lower levels of the pizzeria. Well, I think that only Gregory and Vanessa went back to the pizzeria at some point to set up the Mex's security system, not because they took down Burntrap, because again, that never happened. We know this is newer technology, and the way Gregory talks about this system in the very last scene of Ruin, it makes it seem like he was the one who made it. But obviously we can assume he had the help of Vanessa. But either way, the backpack was nowhere near Burntrap or even the room he was in, as it's in the lower level next to the Mimic. So really, I don't think Gregory even knows about Burntrap, as again, Freddy was never there to free him. And in terms of the Pizzaplex being destroyed and withered, I still think this was because of a fire, but using evidence from a newspaper at the entrance of the Pizzaplex, we learned that all of this was caused by an earthquake. Now this also isn't the most fulfilling answer, but it makes the most sense logically, and it fits in with everything else I've discussed so far in this video. But because there's no more power in the Pizzaplex, we can assume the charging station stopped working, which would ultimately kill Burntrap, as this was the only thing keeping him alive. But finally, what does this mean for the future of Burntrap? Well, unfortunately to me, this is telling us that he won't have a future in the franchise anymore. Now at one point, I do think William Afton was trying to come back in the form of Burntrap, and originally he was going to have a much larger role. We know this because in the very first trailer we heard voice lines from William, and we even saw Burntrap at the end of it.
When I first found you, you were nothing. You were small, pathetic. But now, you are more. Are you ready?
You will do as I say. You will bring me what I want. And if you fail me, then you will. Both of you burn!
With the introduction of new characters like Cassie and the Mimic, it's hard to find ways they could keep Burntrap in new storylines, especially since in Fnaf Hop 1 and 2, there's once again no mention of this character. To me, Burntrap being trapped in the charging station is literally and metaphorically shutting the door on this character, which again is unfortunate, as I like the idea of William Afton coming back once more, but I don't see how this character can fit into any new projects. So with all that said, in Five Nights at Freddy's Ruin, Burntrap is still inside of his charging station, as Freddy and Gregory never actually went down to the FNAF 6 pizzeria, since we know the Burntrap ending wasn't canon. The only reason Gregory's backpack was found down there was because he came back to the Pizzaplex with Vanessa to set up the Mex's system. But because of an earthquake killing all power in the Pizzaplex, Burntrap's charging station failed to work properly, killing him and this character. But this is all just a theory. Now let's look at an answer that will connect him to another character from the franchise, the Mimic. So is Burntrap the Mimic? But first, let's quickly recap each time we've seen these characters. In Security Breach, we saw Burntrap featured as one of the main villains in the Burntrap ending. He was being kept alive using a charging station, and he was awakened when Gregory and Freddy entered the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location. Burntrap then took control of Freddy using monitors in his office, and Gregory was forced to defeat him on his own. Using monitors of his own, Gregory was able to burn Burntrap and his office while also fighting off the blob and its tentacles. Gregory is eventually able to burn down the pizzeria area entirely with Burntrap in it, and he's able to presumably escape with Freddy. And while Freddy and Gregory are happily on a hillside, the Burntrap ending fades to the credits. Now on the other hand, in the bad ending in Ruin, it's revealed that Gregory was not stuck in the Pizzaplex and that it was just instead the Mimic copying his voice to lure Cassie down to the sinkhole to set him free. But after Roxy rescues Cassie, the real Gregory contacts Cassie through the walkie-talkie and tells her to follow his instructions. After the Mimic defeats Roxy and begins to chase Cassie, Gregory gives her specific instructions on how to navigate her way through the caves and how to escape the Mimic. She is ultimately successful when she reaches the elevator, and there the real Gregory reaches out to her once more. He tells her how he understands that what she did was for him and that he's sorry, but they can't risk being followed, so Gregory cuts the elevator, making it fall, and the ending fades to the credits. Now there are a couple of important things to note with each ending, especially with the Burntrap ending, with the most important thing being that it isn't actually canon. In Ruin, we learn that the Princess Quest ending is actually canon, and we have a lot of proof like this arcade machine with a golden sword through it. We also get these drawings made by Gregory that depict all of Security Breach's endings, telling us that these endings aren't canon. This includes the Burntrap ending as we unlock this drawing, so again this ending isn't canon. But just because the Burntrap ending isn't canon, it doesn't mean that these characters don't exist. Just because the ending isn't canon doesn't mean that the sinkhole and charging stations stop existing, as we clearly see them in Ruin, and characters like the Blob also don't stop existing. We also see the Blob in Ruin as a small Easter egg when going down to the abandoned pizzeria, meaning that Burntrap also exists and is somewhere in the Pizzaplex. So again, the whole argument is, what if he's in the Pizzaplex in the form of the Mimic? Now when tackling a question as complex as this one, I think the easiest place to start is by simply looking deep into both of their designs. At the surface, when comparing them side by side, there doesn't seem to be a single similarity at all, but when we start to look deeper, that's when the similarities are obvious. When looking at their legs, they're somewhat similar. Both of the left feet have a different foot than the right one, and both of their left feet only have 3 toes. Both of their left hands have 5 fingers, and their necks are also slightly similar. And finally, they both have a similar pose where their left arm is raised but their wrist is flat. But at the same time, they have many differences. The shape and sizes of their torsos do not match at all. Burntrap's right hand has 5 fingers, while the Mimic's right hand only has 4 fingers. The shape of their heads are also drastically different, and of course Burntrap has pieces of flesh around his body and a human-like jaw with human-like teeth. And the Mimic has none of these, as he doesn't have flesh around his body and he has animatronic-like teeth. And finally, Burntrap has purple eyes while the Mimic has orange eyes, so really they do have more differences than similarities, but the fact that their left arms and legs are so similar must mean something. But what would explain all of the differences? Well, the best way I can explain it is to look at Springtrap and Scraptrap's design. They are supposed to be the exact same character, but they have many differences. Their bodies don't match, with Scraptrap's body being more withered and skinnier. They also have different eyes, with Scraptrap only having one eye and it being silver. And of course their heads are very different, as we can see Scraptrap's skull and his jaw is much wider. But the reason they're so different is because of the fire at Fazbear's Fright. So what if, because of the earthquake that destroyed the Pizzaplex and because of all the damage done to the structure, Burntrap's design drastically changed to the Mimic's design? This would make them the exact same character, but really this argument could go both ways, and I don't think we can make a final decision based on just their designs. So what if we instead look at their roles in each game and look how each character functions? In Security Breach, Burntrap is trying to take control of Freddy, and we can assume he already has control of the other animatronics. We assume he's doing this as it's actually Willie Mafton coming back in the form of Burntrap to take back his life and power. The Mimic has similar motives where he's doing everything in his power to become free and presumably escape the Pizzaplex. Now why he exactly wants to escape so bad isn't necessarily clear. But if it's true that the Mimic is actually glitch-trapped, that just means that the Mimic is trying to copy Willie Mafton and his actions, and the Mimic would just be another way that Willie Mafton could return, making the Mimic's and Burntrap's motives almost identical. In terms of how Burntrap functions, it looks like this charging station is the only thing keeping him alive, and even when he's free, he looks weak and fragile, almost as if Burntrap wasn't done being made. Even the way he walks is also very limp and weak, so again, I think without this charging station, he wouldn't be able to stay alive. But the Mimic, on the other hand, clearly doesn't need a charging station to survive. We can assume he was stuck behind that concrete wall for some time now without a charging station, and again, he appears to be just fine. Even the way the Mimic walks is much different than Burntrap, and he's able to run while chasing Cassie through the caves. He also appears to be much stronger than Burntrap, and there's a clear difference between the two physically. But this just leaves us right where we were with their designs, with that being that the argument can go either way. So to finally make a definitive decision, I'm going to turn to this video, How Ruin Secretly Solved the Burntrap Debate by Underscore. In this video, he goes over how this new texture is in Ruin in the vent leading to Burntrap's Trap's room, and it depicts his right arm clawing into the vent. I recommend watching the full video to understand the full context, and it's also just an amazing theory that we can learn a lot from. But looking back at the texture, it's also in the vent leading right to the Mimic's room, leading him and others to believe that both textures were left by Burntrap, who is also the Mimic. The reason the second claw mark is even there is because the Mimic left it there when he was trapped by Vanessa and Gregory. Although I like this idea, I actually think it means the opposite. The reason that they're the exact same textures to mislead us, but one was left by Burntrap while the other one was left by the Mimic, making these two different claw marks that were left by two different animatronics. Which also leads me to my definitive answer, being that Burntrap and the Mimic are two different animatronics and are not the same villain. Alongside this claw mark in the vent leading to Burntrap's office, we also see this purple glow effect in the vent, and I think this is Burntrap leaving behind a trail. This purple trail is found nowhere else in the game, and this includes the vent leading to the Mimic's room. If they were the same animatronic, wouldn't we see a purple glow effect in either the vent or room, signifying that the Mimic is actually Burntrap? We actually don't see any other hints to Burntrap in the Mimic's room, which only solidifies this idea. Looking back at the purple glow effect, it leads right into this room where Gregory and Freddy fought Burntrap in Security Breach, and in that room there's this charging station. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, I believe that Burntrap needs a charging station to survive, so what if he went through this vent to try and find another charging station, leaving behind this purple glow effect? He could have also found a way to go up the sinkhole where there's another charging station in the Fnaf 6 pizzeria, which would also keep him alive. I think Ruin purposely hides these two rooms from the player because that's where Burntrap is trying to survive. So because of their designs that are too different to be called the same, because these two characters function drastically different, and because the Mimic has no other hints to Burntrap, I think it's safe to say that Burntrap and the Mimic are not the same character. There have now been two FNAF projects where we haven't seen Burntrap, and it could be very well that we won't see this character anymore in the franchise. Personally, I do believe and hope that we do see Burntrap once again as a main villain, as not only is Burntrap's story not finished yet, but of course the Mimic story also isn't finished, and there's so much that can be done with both these characters. There is a popular theory going around that believes all of the villains in the newer games will come together to either create a new villain or will serve as the main villains to a new FNAF project. Burntrap, the Blob, and the Mimic are all still down in the Pizzaplex, and their stories could be continued as the main villains in a new FNAF game. Next, let's look at a solution that I haven't seen many people in the community talk about, which are the Ruin Caves. So let's look at how the caves might answer where Burntrap is in Ruin. Well, let's start to go over the crucial piece of evidence that I haven't seen anyone else in the community talk about, which are the caves. Once you make it to the sinkhole, you go through different caves until you find the Mimic, and you have to escape him by once more going through a cave. But one section of these caves is the key to solving Burntrap and other mysteries from the Pizzaplex, and of course I'm talking about the cave with the waterfall, the blue water, the blue mushrooms, and the blue rocks. Now at the surface it may just seem like a normal cave, but it's so much more than that. I think this cave is what powers the Pizzaplex and everything inside of it. Let me explain. I believe that the blue water we see in this cave is the same water or liquid that we see in the charging stations. They're both light blue, and when going near the water and the liquid from the charging station, we hear static, meaning they're electrically charged. And we know the liquid in the charging station powered the animatronics and even gave them life. In the Chica segment in Ruin, we see Chica fall into a broken charging station and she is revived by it, as previously she was destroyed completely and couldn't move. But after she came into contact with the liquid, she became alive once more and was something Cassie needed to run away from. So we can assume if an animatronic came into contact with the water in the cave, something similar would happen, as they would be receiving an extreme amount of power. And we see this exact thing happen with Cassie's flashlight as she enters the cave. The minute she gets near the water, her flashlight overcharges and shuts off. Originally, it was believed that her flashlight ran out of battery, but couldn't Cassie just say that? Instead, she gets frustrated that the flashlight randomly turns off, and again, I think it was because of the electrically charged water. So if we can assume Fazbear's Entertainment used this water to power the charging stations and even the machines used to recharge your flashlight, then we can also assume that they would harvest as much of this energy for the rest of the Pizzaplex. And I think the other caves already proved this. All of the caves inside the sinkhole have the same design and details like these rocks. But the major difference between this cave and the other caves is that these rocks in the caves are missing the blue luminescent light, and they're simply missing the blue water, insinuating that Fazbear's Entertainment has already extracted the water and power source from these caves to power the Pizzaplex, except for this one small cave that still has the blue water. But finally, how does this cave connect to Burntrap and his whereabouts? Well, in one of my last videos, I went over how Burntrap needs a charging station to survive, as in the Burntrap ending understanding, that's where his body was being kept alive, and without it, he seems weak and fragile as he can barely walk. And in that same video, I pointed out the fact that Burntrap left this room and his charging station through this vent. We know this because of the purple glow to it, as he was leaving a trail behind, and it's assumed wherever we find this purple glow, that's where Burntrap has been. So I think that he left this room to try and find another charging station so he can keep himself alive. As there's the charging station that was in the room where Gregory and Freddy first found Burntrap, or the charging station found in the Fnaf 6 pizzeria. But we can assume that those charging stations have been destroyed after the damage done to the Pizzaplex, and in Help Wanted 2 we even see this charging station completely destroyed. So where else would Burntrap go to save himself? Well, he would have to go to the only power source left, this cave. Now I know that might seem far-stretched and random, but realistically this is the only form of energy left in the Pizzaplex that would save Burntrap, and there's one piece of evidence that proves this. Remember that purple glow trail that Burntrap left behind when he left his room through the vent? Well, in that video I stated that we only saw this purple glow in this vent and nowhere else in the Pizzaplex, meaning Burntrap wasn't in any of the areas where ruin takes place, as again wherever we see this purple glow, that's where Burntrap has been. But this is actually wrong, as we see this purple glow effect in only one other area in the entire game, and that's in the cave. At the very top of the cave, we see this small area that also has the same purple glow effect from the vent that is only found in these two areas, insinuating that Burntrap was there. We also find these interesting textures on this rock, and maybe they were left there by Burntrap. Now, it's not clear if Burntrap actually made his way to the top of the cave or if he was just in the cave in general, but this purple trail has to confirm that Burntrap was in that cave at one point, and he most likely visited the cave after leaving through the vent. But this also means that Burntrap is still somewhere in the Pizzaplex or in the sinkhole, but it's not clear where specifically he is, as we don't see this purple trail anywhere else in the game. But the fact that it's in this cave means it's important to his whereabouts, and again, at one point he was in this cave. This also means he came into contact with the electrically charged water, which we can assume would have a similar effect as the charging station, so maybe this blue water would save him and give him life like it did for Chica. But because there's so much water and because this energy would be massive, we can only imagine what effect it would have on Burntrap, and it could possibly even make him stronger. And although the next game in the franchise is going to be FNAF Secret of the Mimic, which is an origin game for the Mimic, meaning it won't be the next game in the timeline, I still think the game after Secret of the Mimic will revisit the sinkhole and the Pizzaplex, as there's still so much left to be said, like the character of Burntrap. I've already made plenty of videos covering what this game will look like, but no matter what this gameplay looks like, I think it's safe to say that Burntrap will be a part of it in some way, and this cave is our first look at that. So because the water from this cave is actually a power source that powers the Pizzaplex like the charging stations, it makes the most sense that Burntrap would want to reach this cave, as he needs the same water or liquid from the charging stations to keep him alive, which again are found in this cave. And we know he's successful in reaching this cave, as we see a purple trail left by him at the very top of the cave. So though we don't know where he went after this cave, what we do know for certain is that he was in this cave at one point. Finally, let's look at Burntrap's original purpose in the FNAF franchise, and if this original purpose answers who this character is. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, in the Scott Cawthon interview, we learn new details from the newer FNAF games, the movie, and even the books. And when covering FNAF Security Breach, Scott Cawthon had this to say about Burntrap and what his original plan was when discussing how he felt about the overall game.
But I think in this case, it's okay. When it comes to Burntrap, originally, Burntrap was never supposed to move. He was supposed to just be something you saw in the corners, or like if you were walking past machinery, you might be able to peek in between two things and see him in the corner or propped up against a wall, almost like a some kind of decaying movie prop, and you never fully understood what his purpose was. And he had a very specific purpose, and I'm not going to say what that purpose was, but realistically, he never moved. Well, obviously, that's not what we got in Security Breach. In Security Breach, we got a capsule opening and purple smoke flowing out and him climbing out and coming to get you. And so it's just not quite the same thing. So,
like he says in the small clip, it's obvious how different Burntrap was in Security Breach compared to his original idea, especially when considering that Burntrap was never supposed to move, which is almost hard to imagine. But what I think is the most important thing to take away from this clip is the fact that Burntrap wasn't supposed to move for a very specific purpose, but Scott Cawthon hides this purpose from us. So I want to solve what this original purpose was, and if we're going to see Burntrap in a future FNAF project. In order to solve what his original purpose was, I think a perfect place to start is with the very first teaser trailer that gave us unused voice lines of Burntrap and a new scene that wasn't used in the final version of the game. So let's look at these cutscenes and see if they help us with answering what his purpose was.
When I first found you, you were nothing. You were small, pathetic, But now, you want more. Are you ready?
You will do as I say. You will bring me what I want. And if you fail me, then you will, both of you, burn!
Realize.
In the first voice line, we can assume it's Burntrap or Glitchtrap speaking to Vanessa before she would become Vanny as he's preparing her for what's to come. In the second voice line, we can assume this is actually Burntrap because of the slightly different voice, and again, I think he's still talking to Vanessa. When he refers to both of you, I think he's referring to Vanessa and Vanny as two separate entities, or he could simply be talking to Gregory and Vanny, but either way, I don't think any of these voice lines reveal to us what his purpose was, and neither does the last scene. Scott Cawthon made it clear that Burntrap was not supposed to move at all, and in this clip we clearly see him moving. And although we never saw the scene in the final game, I still think this was created after Burntrap's purpose was changed. And this could just be an alternate scene to when he was revealed. That's why we even see the purple smoke behind his arm, and again, all of this was most likely planned after the change. So this just brings us right to the beginning. What was his original purpose? Well, I think it could be one of two ideas, with the first simply being that the reason Burntrap never moved was because he was actually a hallucination. Now, this was actually a popular theory when Security Breach was first released, and now it makes a lot more sense with Scott Cawthon's statement. The reason Burntrap would randomly appear throughout the Pizzaplex and wouldn't move is because he was simply a hallucination. And in the very first teaser trailer for Security Breach, in one of the shots, we might have actually seen this hallucination. In the very corner of this shot, we see what appears to be the outline of someone, and when brightening this image, we can see that this someone resembles Burntrap. We can see the outline of his face, and what if this was the very first tease of a hallucination of Burntrap before plans were changed? But if this was the case, what would be the purpose of Burntrap being a hallucination? Well, I think it could really only be for one reason, which is to show that Willie Mafton's presence is in the Pizzaplex. We know the last time we saw Willie Mafton was in Five Nights at Freddy's 6 when he was burned inside the pizzeria, and it's this pizzeria that is right under the Pizzaplex. So it could be possible that his soul is still inside the pizzeria, which would allow him to access the Pizzaplex, which would then cause the hallucination of Burntrap. But of course this can be debated, as it was assumed the last time we saw Willie Mafton's soul was in a purgatory in Five Nights at Freddy's Ultimate Custom Night, but maybe this would have been a way to set up Willie Mafton's return in another way before their plans changed with Burntrap, or it could have been to prove another popular theory, being that Gregory was under Glitchtrap's control the entire time. Now, although this topic can be a video on its own, Burntrap would serve the purpose to prove this, as the only reason Gregory would be able to see Burntrap was to show he was under the virus's control, and this idea is more related to the novels and the GGY story, but I could still see this being one of the original plans. So what if Burntrap's original purpose as a hallucination was to show that Willie Mafton was still present in the Pizzaplex? But moving on to the next idea, what if his purpose is related to another character? Well, I think that his original purpose was the equivalent to what Vanny's purpose is in the final version. In Security Breach, Vanny would randomly appear throughout the game, and she would make your screen glitch while trying to capture you, or she would just walk by you like we saw in this scene when we're in the charging station with Freddy. And I think Vanny's purpose is to tease a greater threat in the Pizzaplex and to tell the player that she's not alone. And this greater threat is of course Burntrap in the very end of the game. So although this can be debated, I think Vanny's purpose was to set up Burntrap. So I think Burntrap's original purpose was to set up a greater threat in the Pizzaplex, and based on what we know, he would actually act very similar to Vanny. Instead of chasing the player like Vanny would, Burntrap would just instead stand still and would creepily be standing in different areas of the Pizzaplex. This would honestly be much scarier than seeing Vanny chasing you around, as it would be chilling to just see him standing there. Maybe he would have also made your screen glitch or fill it with a purple light like the purple smoke from his charging station, but either way he would have served the purpose of setting up the main villain and its ending. If Burntrap was only supposed to stand still in certain areas, then we can assume he wouldn't have gotten his own ending and he wouldn't have been the main villain of the game. The same way Vanny wasn't really the main villain of Security Breach. But if Burntrap was setting up a greater threat, now the question is, who would that greater threat be? Well, I think the answer is obvious, as it would be the Mimic. Scott Cawthon also talks about the Mimic in this interview, stating how he's one of his favorite antagonists from the franchise. So what if the Mimic was originally set up in Security Breach with Burntrap teasing his appearance, meaning we would have gotten a Mimic ending instead of the Burntrap ending. In this way, the Mimic would have had a more significant setup than how it felt when he was revealed in Ruin. But this would also mean that we would have seen Burntrap in other projects as well if we're following the same timeline of events that Vanny appeared in. We could have possibly seen Burntrap in Fnaf Ruin or Fnaf Help Wanted 2, as he would have had a greater role. role. But unfortunately, we never saw this happen, as the last time Burntrap had a direct appearance was in FNAF Security Breach. So really, no matter what Burntrap's original purpose was, I think this would have set up more appearances like in Ruin or in Hope Wanted 2. But because his purpose was drastically changed, this never came to be, which also leads me to believe that Burntrap won't have a role moving forward with FNAF. Although Burntrap is one of my favorite characters in all of FNAF, I don't see how he could have a role in any of these newer games, especially when looking at the direction it's headed in. Looking at the interview once more, Scott Cawthon stated how he could see different characters returning in the franchise once more, like Vanier the Mimic, but he never brought up Burntrap possibly returning, and he only mentioned Burntrap when discussing his name and original purpose. So this also leads me to believe that he will no longer be in the franchise, especially when considering that he didn't appear in Ruin or in Hope Wanted 2, and it's almost impossible to expect him to appear in the next project. So with that said, Burntrap's original purpose was to set up Willie Mafton or the Mimic's return in some way, but his purpose was changed to be the main villain of Security Breach, which ultimately ended the possibility of him returning in new projects. And with all of that, this is everything we know about Burntrap's original purpose. Moving on to answering one of FNAF's most beloved characters, who is Glamrock Freddy, and I want to discuss a solution that I haven't seen many people discuss, which connects him to Golden Freddy. First, here's why I don't think the crying child can be the same person as Gregory. Besides their similar designs that aren't close enough to make a definitive decision, their characters are nothing alike. In FNAF 4, the crying child was a kid who was terrified of the animatronics. In multiple minigames, we would see him try to do everything in his power to avoid the animatronics, but when he couldn't, he would break down and begin to cry, hence the name. Even when Michael and his friends threw him into the mouth of Fredbear, he was obviously crying, and again, he was always scared of these animatronics. But in Security Breach, Gregory feels like the opposite. We know he never once feels scared of the animatronics, as he is able to destroy all of the main animatronics and steal parts from them. And he even crawls inside of Freddy when he's shut off. So again, they're different in that sense, and their personalities never feel alike. If anything, I think the crying child's personality resembles closer to Glamrock Freddy, which would also make him Golden Freddy. But first, let's go over who exactly Golden Freddy is. Throughout the franchise, we know of two souls possessing the Golden Freddy animatronic. The first being the crying child when he was thrown into the mouth of Fredbear, killing him, and the second soul being Cassidy. Cassidy was stuffed inside the Fredbear animatronic by Willie Mafton after his first murder spree. So throughout the franchise, both Cassidy and the crying child take control of Golden Freddy in different ways, but at one point both spirits are freed. In FNAF 3, after completing the Happiest Day minigame and unlocking the happy ending, we see the crying child's spirit be freed after having his birthday party. Now this can be debated, but in FNAF Ultimate Custom Night, we do see Cassidy's spirit be freed after completing the Old Man Consequences Easter egg while she was torturing Willie Mafton in a purgatory. We see the Golden Freddy animatronic twitch while the screen fades to black. Now it is debated if her spirit was freed in this moment, but I think it was. But we know for a fact that both spirits return in FNAF Security Breach. It's well known that Cassidy returns in the form of the princess in all of the Princess Quest minigames. In the game files, she's even labeled as Cassidy. We can assume that Cassidy returned to defeat the virtual version of Willie Mafton, which is Glitchtrap. But if Cassidy is stopping the virtual version of Willie Mafton, then who's stopping the physical version of him, which we know is Burntrap? Well, this is where I think the crying child comes into play. Now I'm sure that you may be thinking that it would be impossible for the crying child to return since his spirit was freed back in FNAF 3, and this would be true except for one minor detail. In the same ending, we also see the puppet spirit be freed as their mask falls down alongside the other spirits. But we see the puppet in later parts of the timeline, like in FNAF 6 in the form of Lefty, and there are some theories that we even see the puppet in Security Breach as we see Nightmare Puppet plushies throughout the Pizzaplex. So this proves that although souls can be freed from an animatronic, it is still possible that they could return in some way. So what if Golden Freddy or the crying child returns in FNAF Security Breach to stop the physical version of Willie Mafton? Now that may seem far-stretched, but the evidence is right there in the form of parallels. The first being Glamrock Freddy's personality. At first, I thought it resembled the personality of Michael Lafton, and for the most part, it does. But I strongly believe that Michael is still alive and living in the Pizzaplex like I discussed in this video. But Freddy's personality does still resemble that of the crying child's. Throughout the game, Freddy never wants to hurt anyone and does everything in his power to avoid conflict. When he first finds Gregory in his stomach, he points out the fact how they should avoid coming in contact with Vanessa, and throughout the game, he almost seems scared of her and the idea of being caught by her. He also never wants to hurt any of the other animatronics, and he even disagrees with Gregory when he brings up the idea. So overall, his personality feels more timid and fearful, which resembles the crying child more than Michael. And when Freddy brings Gregory to the first aid station, he tells him this.
I feel you are broken.
Don't worry about it, I'm fine.
No, I feel that something is wrong. I am taking you to the first aid station.
This is a direct reference to what we know William told the crying child in the hospital. He tells him, "You are broken." It's a direct parallel to Fnaf 4, but this time the crying child is saying it to Gregory. But moving on to another direct parallel we see is the fact that Freddy loses his head in the canon ending. Now obviously the crying child doesn't actually lose his head to Fredbear, but every other time the crying child is referenced, he is missing his head. Like above the sticky note room where we see the staff bots representing each member of the Afton family, and for the crying child the staff bot is missing their head. So again, I think Freddy missing his head is a parallel to the crying child. And in Ruin, we see yet again another parallel. The only time we encounter Glamrock Freddy in Ruin, he has a completely different design. Not only is he missing his head, but he has a hole in his chest making a mouth. And what other animatronic in the entire franchise has a similar design with their stomach being a mouth? That's right, Nightmare Fredbear, who is also Golden Freddy, who of course is the crying child. His stomach even opens up making a mouth, so again, I think this design choice is to tell us that Glamrock Freddy is the crying child. But in Security Breach, there's a small detail that I think many people misunderstood. When you first go down to the abandoned pizzeria, Freddy will say this when finding the blob.
My friends are here. They're so angry, confused. But I can protect you. I am not me.
Now there are many theories to what this line was referring to, but I think it was about the crying child referring to his friend's souls or agony that were now stuck inside of the blob. We know that the blob was created using parts of endoskeletons and parts from animatronics from the special delivery service. This is why we see characters like Chico or Bonnie even though their original versions have already been destroyed. The blob is also fueled by agony, which is a substance that is fueled by pure hatred and rage, so the agony inside the blob comes from the souls of the children who still have hatred for William Afton, who we already know came back in the form of Burntrap. So when William came back, so did the souls of these children in the form of agony inside the blob. So I think that the crying child can feel the agony of his friends who were other animatronics, which is why he says they are angry and confused. And again, this is just more evidence that the crying child is Glamrock Freddy. So with all of that said, I think the crying child's soul came back and possessed Glamrock Freddy after the Pizzaplex had already been built and after William Afton had returned as Burntrap. The crying child returns to stop his father and to protect Gregory, unlike the way he was protected. He has a chance to stop history from repeating itself by having someone else injured by these animatronics. And that's why he speaks to Gregory the same way William did, as he's now acting like a father figure for him. But eventually, Freddy loses his head in the same sense the crying child did, and in Ruin, Glamrock Freddy becomes the crying child's worst nightmare, which was Nightmare Fredbear. But this is just a theory. Next, let's cover a theory that goes over a simple display from Fnaf Security Breach that seems to have been overlooked by the community, which is this eye. Rockstar Row was featured in the opening of Security Breach, and it's a museum featuring old and new artifacts from the franchise. And on the surface, it may just seem like this museum only serves the purpose to hold fun Easter eggs and to show how much time has passed in the timeline. I'm sure many people, including myself, only look through the displays when playing for the first time, but after that, it's easy to just walk past it and completely ignore it. Even when doing research about this room, I couldn't find any theories on it, and anything else I found online was focusing on the wrong thing, as I think one of these displays is the key to solving Fnaf Security Breach in the next games that follow. But first, let's look at each display in Rockstar Row. And going in chronological order, we see Fnaf 1's Freddy's foot and bow tie, Freddy's arm and ear, Freddy's mic and its stand, Chica's torso, foot, and her infamous cupcake, and Bonnie's guitar, and finally we see Foxy's torso and jaw. We then see various posters from FNAF 2 and from FNAF 3. We also see these toys from the FNAF 4 bedroom, but we don't see any artifacts from FNAF's sister location. In the corner of the room, we can find cardboard cutouts of Dreadbear, Ennard, Shadow Bonnie, Nightmare Balloon Boy, Circus Baby Plush, and Plush Trap. We also see this stage from FNAF Help Wanted, and it's supposed to be a replica of the first FNAF stage. But finally, we see Glamrock Chica's old guitar, this film reel with the label movie on it, and we see this display with what looks to be animatronic parts and one single eye, and this is the display I think is crucial. Even when replaying Security Breach, this display would always grab my attention, but I never really knew why. Something about it just felt important. It wasn't until I realized that it's obvious where every other single display is from except this one. We know these parts were from FNAF 1, we know this stage was from FNAF Help Wanted, and we know these posters were from FNAF 3, but nothing in this display told us where it's from or what it even means. And this is when I began to dig deep and answer who this eye belongs to. I simply started by searching the term missing eye with FNAF, and I found that only 3 animatronics out of the entire franchise fit this description: Mangle, Ennard, and Lefty. Immediately, none of these animatronics caught my attention, attention as they don't seem important enough to be shown in a display. They also have no real connection to each other, so I quickly reached a dead end. I then thought of going through the game files, as it was possible the name for the asset would reveal who the eye belonged to. And right as I was opening the file for the main Rockstar Row floor, I would come to find that all of the game files were named the same, so again I reached a dead end. But one of my last ideas was to look closer into the actual displays themselves, and that's when I realized they all have a colored tag that puts them in a certain group. Any display with the yellow tag meant the artifact was from the Fnaf 1 location, like Freddy's bow tie. Any display with the gray tag simply meant it was one of the animatronics guitar, like Bonnie's original guitar. But 4 items have a pink tag that was hard to put into a group: the eyes and parts, Foxy's jaw and torso, the Fnaf 4 toys, and this random gray device. Again, these 4 artifacts have nothing in common, but I started to compare the eye to all of Foxy's eyes through the franchise, but none of them were a direct match or really seemed that similar. But this is when I had one last idea, which was a bit desperate, but it was really the only option I had left, which was to grab a 3D model of each individual animatronic, add them to Blender, and take them apart to really compare the eyes. Now, I only checked animatronics from Fnaf 1 to Fnaf sister location, and I also made sure to skip Fnaf 4 and Fnaf 3 animatronics since they aren't actually real. But there were still a lot of animatronics to go through, and this process ended up taking a decent amount of time. I also made sure to try my best to only use models from Fnaf Help Wanted and Fnaf AR to make sure I was as accurate as possible when comparing these eyes. I would take off the mask and parts of the endoskeletons to take a better look at the eyes, and I did this for each character. But each time I found the same result. The eyes wouldn't be a direct match, and most of the time the eyes just looked like any other standard animatronic part. From the original Freddy, to Balloon Boy, to Ballora, I kept dissecting these animatronics to try and find an answer, but again I hit a dead end, and eventually I had looked into each animatronic. At this point I felt even more desperate, so I started to look into random animatronics to see if there was some connection, and that's when I found it. It was right in front of me the whole time. When dissecting the endoskeleton from Fnaf Security Breach and when looking into the eye and its socket, they look almost identical. We see black and orange in both of them, and they even have a similar shape. But obviously this can't belong to one of the newest endoskeletons, as this eye is much older, but I think it does still belong to an endoskeleton. And what endoskeleton is old while also being crucial to the new Fnaf? Of course, this is the Mimic. Now in Ruin, the Mimic does have both of its eyes, and even when comparing the model to the eye in Rockstar Row, there isn't that much of a similarity, so that's when I turned to the tales from the Pizzaplex novels. In the story, The Mimic, we learn how the Mimic's creator, Edwin, destroyed the Mimic out of anger and frustration. He compressed its face, broke its teeth, bent its spine, crushed its arms, and finally dislocated one of its eyes. And I think it's this dislocated eye that we see in the Rockstar Row display. Now I'm sure that you're thinking this can't be the Mimic's eye, as in Ruin both of his eyes are intact, but we know he's been repaired various times throughout the franchise, so it could be very possible that this is his original eye. I'm sure you've also realized that I haven't talked about the parts next to the eye, and that's simply because no matter how I looked at it, I couldn't tell what it is, and I still really can't. Even when reverse searching this image on Google to try and find something similar, I found nothing. But in the same The Mimic story, we learn that Edwin used unorthodox items like pistons from washing machines and steel rods to create the Mimic. So what if these parts next to the eye are some unorthodox items that were used to create the Mimic? But even if none of this is true, I think another story from Tales from the Pizzaplex tells us something very similar. In Lally's game, we learn that a worker programmed the Mimic to disassemble endoskeletons in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place, as originally this location was meant to be a museum like the one we see in Rockstar Row. But the Mimic would then turn against the worker and tear him and other workers apart, which then closed this location. So what if this eye belonged to one of the animatronics the Mimic dismantled, as it's a piece of what was supposed to be the old museum and the new one? Now I also quickly want to go over a follow-up theory that might answer some questions you had on the last theory. But again, thanks to the massive support of that video, we're now one step closer to finally answering who this eye belongs to. So by looking at the comments, let's once again deep dive into this display in Rockstar Row. Starting with the comment that I received the most, and I mean a lot: what if it belongs to Molten Freddy? Well, in my last video, I actually skipped over Molten Freddy being one of the only animatronics with one eye, as he is just entered after Circus Baby separated from the rest of the circus animatronics. And he was in the fire that destroyed the Fnaf 6 pizzeria. But either way, let's still take a closer look. When importing a 3D model of Molten Freddy into Blender, we find that his eye is actually just an orange disc and isn't an eye at all. This makes sense when considering Molten Freddy is completely made out of trash, and the only real resemblance to the eye in Rockstar Row is that they both have an orange glow. So I don't really think this eye belongs to Molten Freddy. But moving on to the next comment I received the most, which is that the eye belonged to Nightmare Foxy. In my last video, I skipped over looking into the Fnaf 4 animatronics as they aren't real, but this is technically wrong. Using evidence from the latest Tales from the Pizzaplex novel, we learned that the Nightmare animatronics were actually real as they were just mannequins on rails, but a gas would cause whoever was in that room to hallucinate the Nightmare animatronics. So what if this eye belonged to the mannequin that created Nightmare Foxy? Now this would be a viable option, but there would be no real way to know that this eye belonged to Foxy's mannequin, and there's no real way to know the mannequin even had eyes. So because of this uncertainty, I don't think the eye belongs to Nightmare Foxy either. But moving on, as these comments suggest, let's look into the green rooms and the rooms surrounding them. Now in the actual rooms, there wasn't much that could help us answer this mystery. There was mainly just items that matched the animatronics and their personalities. It wasn't until I read this comment when I went into the storage rooms behind the green rooms, and that's when I found something worth pointing out. Now it wasn't an answer to who this eye belongs to, but it was actually another mystery. There are tags and sticky notes in all 4 rooms. These notes are the same in all of the rooms, but again they're important. We can find things like question marks, 3 lightning bolts, food court number 1, a note with the number 141 on it, and finally a note that seems to be a drawing of a peach. You may have noticed that the note with the question marks on it is the same one we see on the Help Wanted stage, insinuating that the workers don't know what it is or where it originated from. So I also think that these tags were at some point on the eye and the parts, and we can assume the workers also didn't know what they are or where they came from, but of course this is just speculation. I could make a whole separate video on these notes and what they mean, but for now let's just move back onto the eyes. But thanks to the comments, I realized to find an answer I needed to look into animatronics that I would never expect, and while working on another video where I covered what the next Fnaf game might be, that's when I found it, a possible answer. When using an image for Glamrock Bonnie, the eyes immediately caught my attention, and just by looking at this one image, I realized that both eyes shared strong similarities. The eyes had similar shapes, and both eyes also had black and orange wires connecting to them. But of course, to make sure my theory was viable enough, I imported a 3D model of Glamrock Bonnie into Blender, and I took apart the mask and endoskeleton. Then when comparing the eyes, there was almost a direct match, and I think this is the closest I've been to answering who the eye belongs to. But why Glamrock Bonnie? Well, when looking at Glamrock Bonnie in Fnaf Ruin, we can clearly see that he has both of his eyes, and the eye in Rockstar Row would have to be much older than when Glamrock Bonnie was created. And Glamrock Bonnie being the answer almost feels random, but the eye is still somehow connected to him. So when doing basic research on this character, I noticed that one trait or detail of Bonnie translates over to the Tales from the Pizzaplex novels and onto another character. We all know that Bonnie is the guitarist of the group, and in one of the stories we learned that a delivery arrived at the Pizzaplex that included state-of-the-art animatronics and an endoskeleton. And the endoskeleton was originally supposed to be the guitarist of the main group, and the endoskeleton is none other than the Mimic. Now why the Mimic was originally supposed to be the endoskeleton for Glamrock Bonnie is unclear. It could be because of the features or because of his overall look and design. But as we know, the Mimic doesn't become Bonnie, so we can assume that when he was created, they still designed him to look like the Mimic, which is why the eyes are so similar. The reason the eye in Rockstar Row looks so similar to Glamrock Bonnie's eye is because it originally belonged to the Mimic. In my last video, I also came to the conclusion that the eye has to belong to the Mimic, and in this video, it's the same, as that's the most fulfilling answer. This great comment points out the idea that the parts next to the eye could be spring locks. This would make sense as most of the Mimic's costumes had spring locks, so what if these parts are spring locks that came from one of the Mimic's old costumes? Sure, the eye could belong to any animatronic in the franchise, but if this were the case, this would almost feel random. By having the eye belong to the Mimic, it's setting him up as not only the villain in Ruin, but as the new villain in the new franchise. It would also tell us a story about how the Mimic has been in the Pizzaplex for longer than we realized, just like the other Easter eggs in Security Breach tell us that same story, like the sticky note room. I know this answer may feel too on the dot for setting up a future game and a new villain, and I don't necessarily think that the eye even belongs directly to the Mimic, but by the eye at least representing the Mimic's presence in the Pizzaplex, it makes us aware that there's a new villain in the franchise, and it also means he's someone we should be paying close attention to, and we should be looking into every detail that relates to him. So with all that said, I still believe that the eye in Rockstar Row belongs to the Mimic, or at least represents his presence. Moving on, let's look at the secret ending of Ruin that connects to one of Fnaf's oldest games, Fnaf's sister location, and let's answer what this ending means. First, let's go over a quick recap of what we saw in the Fnaf Ruin scooping scooping ending. In order to unlock this ending while being chased by the mimic, you need to ignore Gregory's directions and go through a specific set of doors. And the only way to unlock these doors is by using hidden camera stations throughout the game. When opening all of the doors and when running through all of the rooms, in the very last room there's a red button that will activate this ending. After pressing it, the mimic will then run into the room while trying to capture you, and the scooper then scoops the mimic out of his costume, presumably destroying him. And with that, the scooper ending, or what is also known as the good ending, fades to the credits. Now there are a couple of important things to note with this ending, with the first being the fact that the mimic wears a lion costume throughout the entire ending. With all the other endings, the mimic's design stays the same, as we only see the lion costume in the room where he's revealed, so it's obvious the costume has some importance to the ending. In the books, we learn of different costumes that the mimic wears, so maybe this is just another way of connecting the books to the games. But moving on to the scooper and the main focus of this video, it's important to note that this is not the same scooper as the one we saw in Fnaf's sister location. When looking at their designs, they're not that similar at all. The scooper from Ruin looks much more advanced and modern compared to the one in sister location. It has a much simpler design, and even when comparing the blueprints to the Ruin scooper, there's still a big difference. Also, when comparing the rooms themselves, there's a big difference with the one from Ruin having a door in between the windows while the one from sister location doesn't. The sizes and colors of the room are also drastically different. Besides the scooper itself, there also just isn't any other hints or Easter eggs to sister location, which again leads me to believe this is a different room and scooper. Even if it was the same exact machine, that means that the sister location bunker would be right under the Fnaf 6 pizzeria, which is right under the Pizzaplex. Although this would be a cool and unique idea, I don't think it's possible when considering everything we know about the underground bunker and where it was located, so again, these two scoopers are different. So what exactly did the scooper from Ruin do to the mimic? Well, as the name suggests, it scooped the insides of the lion costume, which was the mimic itself. We saw the exact same thing happen in Fnaf's sister location when the Funtime animatronics had their insides scooped out, which were their endoskeletons, and it's these endoskeletons that morphed together to create the new animatronic Ennard. We also see Michael's insides be scooped out so Ennard could use his body to escape the underground bunker. But if the mimic itself was scooped, then where is he? We only see the empty suit before the ending fades to the credits, and again, it seems like the mimic just disappeared. But I think this was intentional so they could hide what actually happened to the mimic. In sister location, although the Funtime animatronics were scooped, this didn't necessarily destroy them. They were still functional and could move around, which allowed them to morph into Ennard. Now this could have been because they were somehow still possessed by a child's soul, or it could have been because of Remnant, but I think we see this exact same thing happen with the mimic, just with agony. Agony is a substance that is fueled purely by hatred, sadness, anger, and the bad memories infused with one's soul. And in the books, we learn that the agony from the mimic's creator when he beat the mimic until he was almost destroyed is what caused him to become possessed. And I think it's the same agony that is still alive and present after the mimic was scooped, which again would allow him to move freely as this pile of animatronic parts. But where would this pile of animatronic parts go, and what would he do? Or more specifically, who would he go to? Who else in the entire franchise was made as a prominent villain in the new games, and they even showed up in Ruin as a small Easter egg? Of course, this is the Blob. When going down to the abandoned pizzeria, the Blob can be seen retracting itself into a wall, meaning he's still somewhere present in the Pizzaplex. So what if this pile of animatronic parts, which is the mimic, morphs with the Blob, which would create a new animatronic fueled on even more agony? It's assumed that the Blob is fueled by agony from the dead children's souls, so we can only imagine this would intensify if the mimic somehow found it and again morph with it. This would then set up the main villain in the next project that would take place after Ruin. But you may be thinking that the scooper ending isn't canon in Ruin. The bad ending is canon, where Cassie escapes the mimic, but she's ultimately betrayed by Gregory. But it's never actually been confirmed which one of these endings is canon, and it could be very well that the scooper ending is canon and not the bad ending. When Security Breach was released, for the longest time it was believed that the Burn Trap ending was canon. It wasn't disproven until Ruin was released, when it was revealed that the Princess Quest ending was actually canon, and again not the Burn Trap ending. So something similar could happen with this ending, and even if it turns out that it isn't canon, I'm sure they can still find a way to mention the scooping room and the lion costume. Since they seem crucial to the mimic and to the future FNAF, we can assume it's just a matter of time before we see them in a future FNAF project. So with all that said, the scooping room in Five Nights at Freddy's Ruin is different from the scooping room in FNAF's sister location, and the scooping room might reveal to us the next villain in the FNAF franchise. The mimic would now be a pile of animatronic parts, and it still has to be somewhere in the Pizzaplex, so what if he morphed with the Blob, who is also in the Pizzaplex, creating a new animatronic? But of course, this is just a theory. Next, let's look at one of the most complicated mysteries from Ruin, as it has divided the community completely, with that mystery being the canon ending. It's heavily debated who cut the elevator making Cassie fall, as some fans believe it was the Mimic while other fans believe it was the real Gregory, so let's answer who betrayed Cassie. For a quick recap, in the bad ending, it's revealed that Gregory was not stuck in the Pizzaplex and that it was instead the Mimic copying his voice to lure Cassie down to the sinkhole to set him free. But after Roxy rescues Cassie, the real Gregory contacts Cassie through the walkie-talkie and tells her to follow his instructions. After the Mimic defeats Roxy and begins to chase Cassie, Gregory gives her specific instructions on how to navigate her way through the caves and how to escape the Mimic. She is ultimately successful when she reaches the elevator, and there the real Gregory reaches out to her once more.
The Nexus security program was designed to keep it hidden, but you shut down the security, and now it's free. It's not your fault. I know you did it for me, to save me, but we can't risk being followed. I'm sorry.
Gregory? No!
Now at the surface, it seems like Gregory was the one to cut the elevator, but shortly after the DLC was released, the community was quick to point out that this was instead the Mimic. Whenever the subtitles and ruins stack on top of one another, it signifies that two different people are talking at the same time. And this is exactly what we see happen right before Gregory tells Cassie that they can't risk being followed.
It's not your fault. I know you did it for me, to save me.
This means that two different Gregorys were talking at the same time, and it's believed that the second Gregory was the Mimic pretending to be him once more, also meaning it was the Mimic who cut the elevator, making Cassie fall. But again, I personally believe this is wrong, and I'll get back to the caption soon, but for now I want to focus on the game as a whole. Although the Mimic is communicating with Cassie throughout the entire game using Gregory's voice, he's only talking to her using pieces of Gregory's voice that already exist. For example, when the Mimic first introduced himself, he uses the exact same line and stutters that Gregory uses when he's first inside Freddy's room.
Gregory? I'm Gregory.
Your guest profile is unknown to me. Who are you?
I'm Gregory.
Gregory.
And this is the same throughout most of the story. That's why it almost seems unnatural the way Gregory is speaking, since it's actually just different parts of sentences morphed together to create a new one. But when the real Gregory is talking, this isn't the case, and we actually hear new dialogue that wasn't in Security Breach.
Really, you.
I've been trying to reach you all night. I'm not at the pizza place. Something's trying to trick you.
It sounds natural when he talks, and I think it's obvious when the real Gregory is talking, and this includes right before the elevator is cut. This is all new dialogue that the Mimic would not be able to recreate, and even the way Gregory talks feels real, which brings me to my next point, which is sympathy. Why would the Mimic treat Cassie with sympathy and feel sorry for her? We hear Gregory tell Cassie how he knows that what she did was all for him and that he's sorry for her. Why would the Mimic say this and apologize to her? Why would he even talk to her at all if Cassie already knows she was being tricked and knows who he is? There's no reason to manipulate her anymore to get what he wants. He could have easily just cut the elevator if he wanted to without needing to say anything to her. Which also brings me to my next point, which is that it isn't confirmed if the Mimic can even control the elevator. Although it's believed that the Mimic and Helpy are the same thing, it's never been confirmed, and it could be very possible that these are two separate entities. Game theorists made a few theories that there are actually two different Mimics, one virtual Mimic and one physical Mimic. The physical Mimic is in the sinkhole, while the virtual Mimic is in a sense free and controls different parts of the Pizzaplex like the elevators. If this is true, why would the virtual Mimic cut the elevator and he would have no reason to trick Cassie once more? But finally, what about the captions? Well, I think this is a pretty simple answer. It's just simply interference with the connection. We see something very similar when Cassie uses the first elevator to go down to the sinkhole, where we hear the distorted music cut in and out. So it would make sense that Gregory's microphone would cut out as the elevator went higher, which is why we heard the microphone interference. So this wasn't two Gregorys talking at the same time, it was just interference with the microphone. And overall, Gregory's actions match his actions in Security Breach. He destroyed all of the animatronics willingly just so he could upgrade Freddy, and he does all of this against Freddy's wishes. He isn't necessarily trying to survive in these moments, and he's just destroying them. So is it really that hard to believe that he would betray Cassie to ensure the Mimic doesn't escape? There's even more evidence that I haven't discussed that comes from the GGY story from the Tales from the Pizzaplex novels, but I'll save that for another video. So it just doesn't seem that out of character for him, and using all of the evidence I discussed, I think we can prove that Gregory was the one who cut the elevator. So with all of that said, because the last segment is entirely new dialogue, because it's not confirmed that the Mimic can control the elevators, and because of Gregory's actions in Security Breach, I think it's safe to say that Gregory did betray Cassie in Five Nights at Freddy's ruin. But to end this video, let's look at what the next FNAF project will be after FNAF Secret of the Mimic is released, and what this game will be about is I believe it will continue right where Ruin left off. He tells her how he understands that what she did was for him and that he's sorry, but they can't risk being followed, so Gregory cuts the elevator, making it fall. Then this ending fades to the credits, but what's the most important thing to know is what we hear right when all the credits pass by.
Cassie.
After the credits, we hear Roxy calling out to Cassie, meaning she wasn't actually defeated by the Mimic after she rescued Cassie. Now, there are also a lot of important things to note with the character of Roxy. In Security Breach, it's assumed that each of the core animatronics except Freddy were corrupted by the glitch trap virus, which caused them to become aggressive, and even Glamrock Freddy points out their different behavior. It's also assumed that the animatronics were under the control of Vanny, which is also why they were hunting down Gregory. We still see them under this effect in Ruin, as we clearly see that Roxy is still trying to hunt down Gregory. She isn't freed from this effect until Cassie deactivated her security node, but it's not clear if all animatronics are a security node, and it's also not clear why Roxy was the last one, but what we do know for certain is that after the security node was disabled, Roxy went back to her normal friendly self. We know she was a much different animatronic than she was in Security Breach, and she's even a friend of Cassie's. She was there when no one showed up for Cassie's birthday party and comforted her. But looking back at the ending, this is the normal Roxy who is not under Glitch Trap's control, calling out to Cassie, which also means she must have survived the elevator fall. Although it can be debated who cut the elevator, and you can watch my video on that theory here, I think it's safe to say that she must have survived if Roxy's calling out to her. Meaning it's only Roxy and Cassie down in the sinkhole, and because there's so much left to be told about these characters, it's led me to believe that Cassie and Roxy will be the main characters in a new FNAF game or in a new DLC. Why include a piece of dialogue if it isn't going to set anything up? And having a game take place in the sinkhole is perfect since, like I mentioned earlier, there's still so much left to be said. So when looking into the possible specifics of this future game, I think the main gameplay would look very similar to how Security Breach worked. We would still be playing as Cassie, but we would also have the option to use Roxy, just like we had the option to use Glamrock Freddy. In Security Breach, Gregory used Freddy through his stomach hatch, but because Roxy doesn't have a stomach hatch like Freddy, Cassie could instead just ride her back, which would serve the same function. And together, their main objective would be the exact opposite of Ruin. In this game, they would be trying to escape the sinkhole instead of trying to enter it. And there are endless possibilities to what the game could look like using the cave in the sinkhole. In Ruin, we only saw what I think is a portion of all of the caves. The sinkhole could go even deeper, where we could see more Easter eggs and references to FNAF 6, FNAF 4, and of course FNAF's sister location. We already saw the scooping room, which was a direct parallel to the scooping room in sister location. So what if this next game confirmed popular theories like the theory that believes the underground bunker is actually the caves we see in Ruin, making these two scooping rooms the exact same? We could also see other hints proving that the FNAF 4 house is somehow in the sinkhole as well, which would also confirm many popular theories. But moving on to the villains that we'll see, in my last video I discussed how the Mimic and Burn Trap are two separate characters, meaning they're both in the sinkhole. We also know the blob is still in the sinkhole, as we saw the blob retracting itself into the wall when going down to the abandoned Pizzaplex, meaning three different villains are still down in the sinkhole with Roxy and Cassie, and I think it's these villains that they will need to defeat in order to escape. Each time they come into contact with a villain, we can also learn more about them and their history. For example, we can finally learn if Burn Trap is supposed to be William Afton, we can learn if the Mimic is one of the Funtime animatronics or where he originated from, and finally we can learn how the blob was created and what its intentions are. So again, this possible game could single-handedly answer some of the biggest questions from the entire franchise. I also think it's very possible that these three villains would morph into one single entity, becoming the final villain of this game. We know that all three of these animatronics are either possessed by Remnant or Agony, so we can only imagine this would be intensified if they all combine into each other. So finally, I can see this game ending with Roxy and Cassie successfully escaping the sinkhole, where they would then meet up with Gregory and Vanessa, who would have a lot to explain to them. So if Roxy and Cassie are still stuck in the sinkhole, their main objective would be to escape while uncovering unsolved mysteries from the past FNAF games like the Scooping Room. They would also defeat the three villains left in the sinkhole, Burn Trap, the Mimic, and finally the Blob. After defeating them, or an amalgamation of them, Roxy and Cassie would escape the sinkhole and meet up with the very people who betrayed them, but of course this is all just a theory. But with that, these are every single one of my theories on Five Nights at Freddy's security breach and the ruined DLC combined into one long video, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. There are some theories that I purposely left out as these theories feel outdated now, and some theories I included in this video are just updated theories, so again, some theories are left out. But for the most part, all theories that I made are included in this video, and let me know if you guys want more of these longer videos where I combine different theories. So make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and thank you guys so much for watching.